I thought that I would start sort of narrowing down or defining a bit how I see career guidance, because I'm very well aware that it is partly context related and also dependent on the national context. So obviously I'm looking at this topic from a Finnish perspective, but hopefully this resonates also with you, and you can find some things connected to your own work, whether you work in career guidance or not, and whether you are working with migrants or not. So I'm looking at career guidance particularly within the context of integration, and as one part of integration measures or integration practices, and then very much linked to the integration policies, and in this case, of course, particularly in Finland. But that's somehow my entry point to the topic. And I've been looking in my research of the career counsellors or career practitioners as street-level workers, so leaning on the concept, the theory of street-level bureaucracy, which means or which looks at public service employees who are positioned between policy and practice. So in this case, it would be the integration policy, but partly also employment policy and education policy, and then the practice or the practical duties these street-level workers are dealing with. So somehow positioned between two levels, if you like to look at it that way. Ideally, how I see career guidance is that it could be a social glue. So something that could enable and enhance people's, and in this case also migrants' participation into the society or new environment where they have moved or starting their new lives in. Also for their recognition as members of that environment and society, and hopefully also perhaps in a broader way of their social inclusion. Why this? Because I think that the career practitioners are trained in dealing with many issues that people face in their lives. So obviously, I'm also thinking of career as something larger, that not only employment or education, but as a livelihood or as a life trajectory, something that includes us all, whether we are employed or not, whether we are in education or not, something that is part of our life stage or life phases or life situations. So this ideally, I think there's a lot of potential in career guidance, but in practice, what happens, especially when I've been looking at the career practitioners working in this field, it is less ideal. It is often a very lonely and messy business, and especially lonely and messy as experienced by the practitioners. But still, I think it deserves to be acknowledged and supported better, be it supervision, be it clearer legislation, be it clearer management structures, or whatever it might be in different situations. So I think there's as I said, I think there's a potential. There's a lot of the career guidance could offer, but at the moment it is perhaps falling a bit short in some places for various reasons, and definitely not because of the practitioners. I'm not thinking that they are doing a bad job, but it's more that they've ended up in tricky situations in their work. The way I've structured now this presentation is that I would talk you through to my doctoral thesis, which is based on 3 articles, 2 published and 1 hopefully to be published soon. The last one has been jammed in a journal for too long a time, way over 1.5 years now. But I'll present some of the findings from the 3 articles, and then I'll have some concluding remarks at the end. But to give you some idea of the context, what I've been looking at is so that is the what we call a Finnish integration program. This is a national measure within the public employment services in Finland, and it is a similar thing that exists in some other countries, for instance, Norway, has a fairly similar, not identical, but fairly similar program. And that is targeted for adult migrants who've been registered as unemployed in their local public employment services or employment offices. And when people come to Finland, so that they've been assigned a place in this program, which is built on modules, and it can last up to 1 year, but depending on how each individual progresses, so the actual length individually can be shorter than 1 year. It is a training program or educational program which has two main components or elements. People are learning what could be called civic skills, so about the Finnish society, labor market, how to enter jobs, how to apply for them, but also about the educational structure and how the society works about in many ways. So there are things related to taxation, the pension scheme, different aspects that people normally, those born in a country or society, learn little by little through their lives when they grow up there. And then the other part is language learning, which has been even a stronger element, but is still a major part of the program. So people would learn Finnish or Swedish, depending which part of Finland they live in. And the civic skills part includes also career counseling, which is taking care of career counselors. So that means one-to-one counseling, in some places group counseling, but then also different work placements, work tryouts, and general planning for future life. So choosing employment or education or applying for jobs or apprenticeship, etc. So I've been looking at the career counseling that takes place in this program, and I collected 2 data sets which are sort of interrelated to each other. It was just before COVID that I gathered my data. So I have recorded on video 18 discussions, so one-to-one discussions between the counselors and their clients, so the adult migrants. And then I went back to the same counselors and I played their own counseling sessions to them. So this is a method which is called in the literature stimulated recall interview. So we were watching together their own discussions, and then I asked them to analyze them, what happens in them, particularly from 2 perspectives. One was social justice, and the other one was how they saw themselves as someone who uses power in those discussions, or how power is present in any way. And then I did a thematic analysis on these 2 data sets. My main question that I was seeking an answer to was how do these career counselors, career practitioners implement integration policy through their daily counseling work and practices? So finding out that how do they turn the policy into practice. And I'll go now to the first sub-study or sub-research or article. And this was one where I looked particularly at the counseling discussions. So those one-to-one encounters between the practitioners and the migrants. They were of different lengths, between 20 and 50 minutes. And the topic there was mainly about how do these migrants find a work placement somewhere in some sector they were interested in, but they were also included discussions about educational choices, employment paths, which jobs to go for. But what was interesting and relevant was also that they were very counselor driven. So the practitioners had in very concrete terms either an electronic form or paper form that they were sort of following. They had a certain set of questions, and they were trying to make sure that they got or they sort of touched upon all the topics on their own agenda during those discussions. And what I did here was that I used one theory related to the power theory family, which is called the non-decision making. And it's a theory or concept that looks into power as taking place when no action or no decision is actually taking place. So instead of having clear idea that, okay, here's something that has been decided or agreed upon, this looks into places where no such clear decision takes place. So the inaction or inactivity of people. And then related to that, there was also another concept called mobilization of bias, which means in this case that how the practitioners were leaning on a certain rules of the game, certain set of frame or framework that related or derived from the organization they were working for, or from the public employment sector and measures. So in practical terms, it means that they had an idea that what this career counseling was supposed to be about, was supposed to contain, and they were following those internal and internalized rules to carry it out. And here I want to see, or I became interested that in these discussions that were, as I said, very counselor driven. So what happened when the migrants themselves wished to address some topics of their own, when they were bringing up some discussion topics, and if they did so, how did the counselors react to those openings or topics that the migrants wanted to bring in to the discussions? And I looked particularly three things. When those places or situations when the migrants expressed some interest of any sort, or wanted to talk about some grievances or sorrows or worries they had, or if they wanted to talk about values that they felt were relevant to their situation. What the counselors did in these circumstances was that either they dismissed the topics that the migrants wanted to bring into the discussion. It meant that they, in the discussions, they ignored some of them, so they didn't actually pay any attention to the topics that the migrants were bringing in, or they downplayed them. They said, yeah, okay, this is interesting, but let's not talk about it now. It's not relevant for the things that we need to discuss here now. Or they acknowledged it in some way, but then they changed the topic into something else, saying, yeah, okay, fine, this is important, but let's instead look at this form, or let's look at your employment plan, or whatever it was. So they sort of diverted the discussion into something else that they felt was more relevant. And these were the moments of clear non-decision making. So there was no action taken on the topics that the migrants suggested. But then there was also less apparent non-decision making moments when there was some advice or information being shared. The counselors might have started checking the facts, so making sure that they understood what the migrant was talking about. But it didn't lead to any sort of further action after the fact-checking moments. They might have also been encouraging the migrants in some way, being very positive about the topic, but again, it didn't lead to necessarily to any further action. Or they were taking some kind of stance or opinion on okay, saying that yes, this is not important now, or this is something that you might now think is relevant, but could you look at it from another perspective, or could you put it aside for a moment? And this meant that most times the encounters became even more counselor driven and counselor centered than what was expected perhaps by any of the parts included. So this was like one part of what was happening in these discussions or in this counseling. And this is looking at what happens on the practical level. If you remember that my starting point was like looking at the practitioners between the policy and practice. So this was like the micro level, if you want, what happens in the actual counseling discussions. The second sub-research that I did, or second article I've done around these topics, was then on a more of a meso level. And here we combined data with a Swedish research project. We did this together with a Swedish doctoral researcher, and we had similar data. So the Swedish data was also from similar instances in the Swedish context. And we wanted to look at how the counsellors in the interviews that we were having with them, how did they experience their own professional agency? We used here concepts from Basil Bernstein, classification and framing. Classification is, well, to put it in a very simplified way, is about symbolic boundaries. Framing is about how different forms of realization taking place in an educational setting. And to give you an idea what this is all about, so if the classification in these settings is strong, for instance, so it means that, for instance, the professional agency is strengthened as the counsellor acts according to the structure. So it means that there's a clear division or difference between other parts of that organization. Let's say in my context, so there would be a clear division between the language learning element of the training program and then the career counseling element, so that there would be a clear division, and certain things belonged to one part and certain things to the other part. And if the counseling was strongly framed, it meant that the practitioner had control over, for instance, the communication or time or how quickly and in how often the counseling would take place. So it was like in their hands what was happening in the counseling. And here what we wanted to see from both the Swedish and the Finnish data was how does the counseling for migrants, how does it inform these practitioners' professional agency? And what we found out was that there were similar things taking place in both Sweden and Finland, or the practitioners or counsellors were talking about similar things. First of all, they were talking about different factors that influenced their own professional agency or how they experienced it. Many of them said that compared to some other counseling contexts, they had to pay more attention to the starting point of their counselees. So they needed to be much more aware where these people came from, what kind of background they had, what kind of experiences they had before they started in the program they were in at the moment. So it was like a wider spectrum of things they felt that they needed to master and manage in these situations or in this relationship. And related to the relationship, they also felt that they needed to perhaps spend a bit more time building trust in this relationship between themselves and their counselees, and they felt that they needed to put more emphasis in building or becoming an ally with these counselees, more than maybe in some other context. Both of these points because they felt that the life situations of these people were so complex, so they couldn't sort of look away from here. They couldn't ignore these sort of background factors or elements that were present when they started working with these counselees. And also they were describing how they felt that the focus of the counseling was maybe shifting or floating more freely, that there were things that they needed to discuss or consider that they wouldn't necessarily do in other contexts. This means, for instance, discussions about if people were, if they had housing, if they had homes, if they had, how was their health situation or things like that, what was happening in the family. Of course, these all could be present in any career situation, but these practitioners said that they felt that they were they felt compelled to pay more attention to these elements, of course, in the constraints of the resources, so mainly the time they could use per each counselee. They were also talking, both the Swedish and the Finnish counsellors, how they balanced between the individual and the society. They felt that since they were dealing with migrants, that there were expectations coming from outside or from above, that these people should fill labor market gaps in the society, so that they should be directed first and foremost to jobs where there were gaps. And there were also, related to that, some descriptions how these practitioners felt that they are good career choices, and then there are bad career choices. So the good ones are the ones where there would be a certain employment, or that there would be sort of recognized need for these skills that people had, or that these migrants should be educated in some skills that there was a need for. So there was like a better route or worse route, and the practitioners felt that they should be directing people to these better choices. They were also talking about different time frames, and they felt that there was a kind of a clash between themselves and the migrant counselees. And this means that the practitioners were often saying that, or they felt that the time needed to get to a certain point, to a profession or a job or education, is much, much longer than what the migrants themselves thought. So there was like from the migrants' point of view, there was a hurry or haste to get somewhere quickly, and they felt that they should be able to do that, while the practitioners were more like saying, "Nah, this takes many more years, and you should rethink your plans, because it is you don't become, for instance, a doctor in 3 or 4 years. It takes much a longer time." And the third aspect that they were talking about, which we thought that related to their professional agency, was that there was this talk about good migrants, so good in quotation marks, which meant that the practitioners felt that some of the people they were working with were doing things as expected, so they were sort of flexible enough, but also maybe in a less nice sense, more obedient. So they were following the advice given, and they were choosing the careers suggested, which meant for the practitioners that it created less professional burdens, less work, more time for others, since the good migrants in quotation marks were causing less trouble in some instances. And the counsellors also felt that they needed to be gatekeepers, so they needed to, as I said, direct people to certain places, but also be sort of the realists in the discussions, realists in their own way of thinking or in their own opinion, so that people wouldn't necessarily waste time in a way to go to strive for certain jobs or professions that were not as easily accessible as others. So all of this for the practitioners or for the counsellors created an experience which we thought could be described as floating or expanded agency. They felt that the boundaries of their work were not very clear, and they had to trespass them very often. They had to sort of reinvent where their professional agency actually is almost every time they were talking with someone. And it felt them to feel also a bit insecure. They were not sure how far they should go, where should they put the boundaries and or the limits of their work. The third sub-study or research that I was looking at was more than on a macro level. if the first one was on the micro and the second on the meso, so the third one is then more on macro level, where the counseling was looked at as part of the integrative system, or as an integrative measure as such. And here also I combined my data, so the counselor interviews particularly, with another Finnish data set with another researcher who'd done similar interviews in primary and secondary education, looking at the counsellors working there with migrants. And here we looked at what kind of discretion, what kind of coping strategies these counsellors, both in the primary and secondary education, and then in the integration program, what kind of discretion and coping strategies they were implementing there. And here particularly we were leaning then on this street-level bureaucracy approach. And we looked discretion as an activity where these counsellors were making decisions regarding their clients and determining also benefits and sanctions if need be. Another concept we used here was something that was coined by a Finnish researcher, Tuuli Kurki, and she calls it immigrantization. I know this may be a bit of a broken English for you, but this is the word that she was using. But with this, she meant kind of a process where immigrants in a new society or new environment are seen more as an entity, as a members of one group instead of individuals, and also to a dynamic where integration policies and practices actually produce what she calls immigrant subjectivity, so that people, when they're seeing and treated as immigrants, the system reproduces this immigrantness within these people. What we wanted to see within our two data sets then was particularly related to these concepts, that how do the Finnish career counsellors use discretion in their counselling work. And what we found out, and again, the same things came up from the both data sets, so regardless of the counselling context that these people were working with, was that in most cases, the integration ideals were overruled by practices. And this means also that the nice idea of having holistic guidance, so covering all life areas or different things related to people's life trajectories, were hampered by organizational and structural issues. It meant in practical terms or in concrete terms, for instance, that there was not enough time to cover it all, so people were forced to make choices. They had to narrow down their counselling focus to some bits or some elements of what was able to do within the counselling sessions or time that they had at hand. They were also using this immigrantization, so this dynamic I just described, as a navigation and coping strategy. So it seemed that people, these practitioners, because they were facing very difficult and burdening situations, and they were often working alone. So they relied on this dynamic of seeing people as members of the group of immigrants instead of going too far into the individual situations, which turned the counselling more into what Barbara Bassett has called the opportunity-centred counselling. So instead of looking at what's possible for this or what's relevant for this client or this person who's there present in the counselling, so it was more about which opportunities are available in this situation or in these circumstances where we are. And the practitioners, the counsellors, were also ending up in kind of an assessment work, that they were assessing how compatible these migrants were with the society, meaning what kind of skills they had, what kind of aspirations they had, what kind of ambitions they had, and if that would be compatible with the needs of the society. And they felt that they were failing in some points, because they felt that this is a difficult task, and also because the society's needs were not always the same as with the individual migrants. So they felt that they were forced to look at the situation from the society's viewpoint, more than from the individual people's viewpoint. And they also felt that the governing of these migrants was an uncomfortable counseling goal. They were not very, or there were some instances where they felt that it wasn't good counseling, it wasn't good guidance, that they should be doing their job as they were doing, but they felt that they were a bit maybe trapped between the policy goals and then the practical realities present in their work. So these are the findings from my PhD project. I had a couple of spin-offs from the same data, and I thought I'll share some thoughts about them with you as well, because this is related to the same topics or same elements. I've been also looking at both at the counseling encounters, the counseling discussions these practitioners had with their clients, and then their interviews, as from the perspective of emotional labor. So I was looking at how do these practitioners regulate their emotions to sustain outward countenance, so to produce things that they thought that, okay, should be produced through the counseling. So for instance, an employment plan or education plan. And I looked at what kind of what I called emotions talk was present in the discussions they had with the migrants, and then in the interviews that I had with them, then based on their respective discussions. What was interesting was that with the migrants, the practitioners didn't really address their own emotions a lot. They were really very neutral, very professional in those discussions, and sort of kept all the emotions away from those encounters. But then in the interviews, there was quite a lot of emotions talk. They were talking quite freely about different things related either to the relationship they had with these migrants, these counselees, or then about the migrants themselves. Different emotions that sort of popped up in the interviews, and I thought that it was interesting. I thought that this was kind of an emotional gap between what they were doing in the practice and how they were feeling inside. Keeping in mind that they were, as I said earlier, they were really feeling themselves quite lonely often, and they had no one to turn to, and they had no supervision, for instance, and they had to deal with these emotions that were evoked by different situations or encounters by themselves as they see fit. And my thinking is that this leads to inevitably to an emotional burden present in the career counseling of this kind. Then another spin-off research that I've done is that we combined my data with the Swiss data, with Swiss career counselors also working with migrants. And there we looked at how the practitioners were managing migrants' aspirations. So aspirations regarding their future employment or education or their future lives in Switzerland or in Finland. And we were looking at their coping strategies in this landscape that we defined as being morally very complex, because there were different elements included and lots of ethical ponderings also included in this counseling setting. And what we found is that the counselors were using two types of strategies to cope. Either they were using what we call owning strategies or then disowning strategies. And here with owning, we mean that how much the practitioners were identifying themselves with the integration policy principles or moral implications coming from above. Within the owning strategies, we identified different types of enforcement, quite direct, but also sometimes less direct. But then also what we call protection from disillusionment, meaning that there was some element of caregiving or even parenting present in the counseling. And then in the disowning strategy part, there were also coping strategies where the practitioners chose to be more clients' situations, or then they were using what we call externalization. So moving or directing the responsibility of certain actions towards some other entity or body or organization or actor present in the bigger picture. So these are some of the things that I've been working with. I hope this gives you kind of an idea of the research I've been doing on this particular situation and with this kind of data, which heavily, of course, relates to the public employment services and things that are present there. I thought I'll conclude with some remarks. Hopefully to wrap this up, and then we'll have some time to maybe have some discussion or questions or comments or debates. I don't know if you have something in mind. But the first thing I wanted to conclude with is that through the different perspectives I've been looking at, I've come to think that these practitioners working with migrants particularly, but I think this might be relevant for also some other contexts, is that there are many ideals present there. Ideals about what is good guidance and counseling, what is a good counselor, what is a good client, many ideals clashing perhaps or overlapping. But then the practitioners need to deal with the harsh realities of the work. They need to somehow find a way how to live with the knowledge of these ideals existing, and then trying to either turn them into practice or them finding a way how to ignore them if it's not possible to turn them into the practice, or if they cause frictions or tensions or problems for them in the daily work that they are doing. And when it comes to integration, in more specifically, I think that one thing that career counselors or we dealing with career counseling or career guidance should be looking more into is the thing that exists or that has been discussed a lot in the integration research, where some scholars are differentiating what they call functional elements of integration and social elements of integration. The functional elements mean things like education, employment, housing, which are sort of the things that often are being dealt with first and which are often considered as the primary or the more relevant ones when it comes to integration and also when it comes to career counseling. But then alongside there are these social elements included in integration or inclusion, but also in career counseling as part of that bigger scheme. And with the social elements, I mean things like sense of safety, sense of belonging, opportunities for participation, also political participation in the new society, but things which are maybe less tangible in the first weeks or months of somebody settling into a new country, a new environment, and also things that are maybe more difficult to deal with, or that they take more time to build or grow than the functional ones. It is perhaps easier and still more concrete to think about employment and education than if someone feels actually safe in the new country or feels that they belong to that new environment. But I think that the social elements should be included and should be considered also in career counseling, because I think they are the more sustainable ones. And our lives are not like they're not building only on the functional elements. We all have these social elements present in our lives. So therefore, I think they are super important. One of the things that I've also been thinking and also been discussing with other fellow researchers in this field is the question that how do we white professionals sort of position ourselves when it comes to issues related to migration, integration, maybe ethnic minorities or other minorities. And here I'm referring to a fellow colleague here from the University of Derby, Professor Charles Chatterton, who's been written amongst other scholars about the idea that how us, the white professionals, we have the responsibility, but also the opportunity to act as advocates and allies for minorities. Because for me, the questions about career counseling in migration is also a question about how do we work with different minorities, ethnic, cultural, whatever minorities they would be involved as our counselees, whilst most of us who identify ourselves as professionals are white. And I think this is an issue that should be discussed more, and we shouldn't sort of ignore it, because it is an existing thing, and it does influence people's lives as well. And then I want to finish with a quote from a late Maltese scholar, Ronald Sultana, who has inspired not only myself, but many others, who's talked about social justice, socially just career guidance. And he said in one article how socially just career guidance is about to be good, to do good, and to act virtuously in relation to others. And then I think what follows is even more important, to the best of our ability. So to the best of our ability, acknowledging our own faults and shortcomings, and within the constraints we have. So paying attention to the systemic and structural constraints, what exists around us. This is a short overview of what I've been working with during the past years. Here's a reference list for those who are interested. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to hear some comments or thoughts or questions, and hopefully be able to answer if any of those appear. I'll stop sharing now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Miika. Okay, I can see that Tristram has a question. Do you want to start with him?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Miika. I find some of it a little bit depressing, really, because I think the practitioners you've worked with, they were like, I suppose I'm quite intrigued. It's like what they felt about this, because I think for us listening from the outside, it seems like they were essentially acting as instruments of the state of sort of compliance, bringing people into line.
Yes.
How did is that how they perceived it? And did they find that to be, you said a bit about the sort of emotional labor aspect at the end. was there any sense that they were kind of kicking against it or trying to find another way, or was that just kind of so impossible to see the way through?
Well, of course, they had very individual ways of dealing with it. So some of them were more of like, yeah, this is our job, this is how it is, so we need to find ways of dealing with it. Others were more like, yeah, I think we could do something else. But what could it be? And I think what most of them were saying was that they were not happy about particularly the time constraints that they had. They wished that they would have had more time per individual clients, that there would have been more time, less people to work with, more time for individuals. But they felt that there was very little they could do to it. And that's why I've been repeating the sense of loneliness that I got from them, because it was a bit, well, it was something I wasn't prepared for. But when I did the interviews with them, they were really, and I know this may sound a bit silly, but they were really grateful that somebody came and looked into their work. And I felt that I wasn't sure if I was the researcher or the supervisor or the mentor or the peer support person there. But that was, yeah. But for me, it was also a sign that we should discuss this more. We should discuss this, how the structure and the system puts at least some career professionals into very ungrateful positions. And I think that only through that we could find some ways to develop the circumstances. Because I think that there were, I don't think that they felt themselves as proper actors in the situations. They felt more like, this is how it is. We need to do our best, and let's try to make most out of it for the people we're working with. But I also want to underline that in no ways I'm thinking that these people would have been doing bad job or bad work. I think that they were doing the best they could, and I think they were really very morally and ethically aware of many hindrances that they were facing, but just trying to find a way around them or over them. So I'm not sort of putting any blame on them. I sort of empathize and sympathize with their situations.
Charlotte.
Thanks, Gazel. Thank you, Miika. I really enjoyed that. And I've read one of your publications, the first one as well, and really enjoyed reading it and really find it interesting what you found there and the way in which you've theorized it and all these different ways in which you've theorized the data, which I found really interesting. And what it's actually making me think of, I know you mentioned my work on whiteness and the racialization of relationships in relation to this, and it made me think of the spaces we have to act in as individuals when it's the structures in many ways that are actually shaping what we can do and what we can't do. And obviously you didn't present anything necessarily which talked much about whether people felt like they could be allies or whether they even felt that was relevant to them. What it actually reminds me of is some work that I did with my colleague Helen Colley a few years ago, which I don't know whether you've read, on the old Connections service in this country, which was a kind of careers service with extra parts, including a youth support service, and it kind of put all of these different things under one hat. And what the practitioners felt there was that they actually had virtually no room to maneuver at all. They were being required to do a kind of social control job. Actually, they couldn't help young people into educational work because there wasn't any, and anyway, they didn't have that kind of authority to do that. In fact, they were more required to go and find out what people were doing, so chase them up, sitting on park benches, and mark them as available for work. And that's all they could do. They had one awful story I remember. They had young people sleeping on the doorstep at the connection service because young people had nowhere to go. And they couldn't find them housing and they couldn't find them jobs. And yet they had them in front of them. So they wanted to be allies and they wanted to help. But it was that the structures were impossible. And the way in which the whole system was set up meant that they couldn't do it. And they were actually in a kind of social surveillance role. And that's in some ways what I'm reminded of. And your data isn't that extreme, but it does make you think, what is your space for manoeuvre and how do you manoeuvre in that space? Which isn't a very positive way of looking at it.
Yes, yeah. It's not necessarily that extreme, and there's also different currents there present in the way people work here. So despite the structural constraints that they might have had, and despite the lack of time, so they were sort of doing these mini rebellions, if I would call them that. They were doing things there, and they were trying to also explain to the migrants, okay, this is how the system works, this is where it puts us, let's make it work somehow. But and remember, what you do now doesn't necessarily mean that you need to sort of follow this route for the rest of your lives. But as long as you are in this position, let's play along the game rules, and let's try to make it work for you. But yeah, of course, there were also like less encouraging moments in how they are working there. Yeah, definitely. So I can relate to that.